Canada, my name is Greg Isaacs, and it's time for a Canadian political revolution. It's time to create a government that works for all of us, not just the 1%, not just the millionaires and billionaires. Should Canada be a country where a person works 40 hours a week and lives in a state of poverty? I don't think that's right. I think it's time for a livable wage so that every citizen of Canada can afford the opportunity to live a decent standard of life. In Canada, should seniors live in a state of fear and anxiety and stress because they don't have enough money to get by? I don't think that's right. I think seniors should have a better pension so that they can afford the necessities without the struggle. It's time to start a conversation and discuss the issues that really matter in Canadian society. Let's talk about the economy of Canada. During the Great Recession, Canadians were told that the foundations of our economy were strong.
One place where none of this banking drama is taking place is Canada.
We will make more money in this quarter than any bank in North America. So for a little Canadian bank sitting up here, that feels pretty good.
How does that happen?
Basically because we didn't do the things that blew other banks up.
Neither did his Canadian colleagues. Last quarter, 2008, all Canada's major banks were profitable, making $2.5 billion. Around the same time, U.S. banks lost more than $26 billion. In fact, since the financial crisis began, American taxpayers have provided more than $300 billion to help bail out more than 450 companies. During that period of time, from their government, Canadian banks have not taken one penny. Canada is the only industrialized nation in the world without a single bank failure in the current economic downturn.
However, over a period of a year and a half, from 2008 to 2010, our biggest banks in Canada got a bailout of $114 billion. That's 7% of GDP in 2009.
Good morning. My name is Bruce Campbell.
Groovy.
I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The conventional narrative about the performance of Canada's big banks during the financial crisis goes as follows. While American banks bet heavily on subprime real estate and had extensive shadow bank holdings, Canadian banks did not.
Ed Clark got out 4 years ago.
As soon as you see that complexity, you say, how can I possibly think I actually can guess whether this will work or not? And as soon as I hear that, I say, get out of it.
It didn't take long for me to discover that this is an entirely different culture.
Sherry Cooper spent years at the Fed overseeing Wall Street before moving to Bay Street, the Canadian equivalent.
The Canadian banks were up to their ankles in the toxic muck, whereas American banks were over their heads.
And so a lot of this is about saying, here are old banking rules, and we're prepared to give up short-term profit in order to make sure that we have a balance sheet that doesn't blow up on us.
Due to Canada's more conservative banking culture and better regulation, Canadian banks, the story goes, didn't need a bailout. The bank's strength allowed them to come through the crisis with relative ease, needing only liquidity support from the government. However, the details of exactly how much each Canadian bank received, when they received it, and what they put up as collateral has remained locked away at CMHC and the Bank of Canada. Not even access to information requests have been able to free this information.
In the report that we're publishing today, I estimate that at peak, Canadian banks received $114 billion worth of support. This figure is equivalent to 7% of Canada's GDP, or the size of Canada's economy, in 2009. Put another way, the support was worth $3,400 for every man, woman, and child in the country. During the financial crisis, Canadian banks drew support from not one, not two, but three separate programs in Canada and the U.S. The first was from the U.S. Federal Reserve, from which they took loans worth at peak $33 billion, converted to Canadian dollars. Second is loans from the Bank of Canada, from which they took $41 billion at peak. And third, CMHC purchased $69 billion worth of mortgages from the banks, over the support period. The three largest recipients of aid were Scotiabank, Royal Bank, and TD Bank, receiving an estimated $25 to $26 billion at peak. CIBC received somewhat less money at $21 billion at peak. And the Bank of Montreal, for its part, received an estimated $17 billion at peak. Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC, at some point during the financial crisis, received aid worth more than the value of the companies themselves.
CIBC got $21 billion, worth 1.5 times the value of the bank. The Bank of Montreal got $17 billion, or 118% the value of its bank. Scotiabank got a $25 billion bailout, the equal value of its bank. In this scenario, it would have been cheaper to just buy out the bank, buy every share in the bank. It would have been cheaper to do that than to bail them out. But it doesn't stop there. TD Canada Trust and Royal Bank of Canada got a bailout of $25 billion and $26 billion respectively. This is the same amount as 69% the value of TD and 63% the value of RBC.
And so, while our politicians were trumpeting the soundness of the Canadian banking system on the global stage, three of Canada's banks were at some point underwater, relying on government support programs to get by. The federal government claims that it was providing liquidity support and acting as a backstop. However, the details released today, and with the details released today, it looks a lot more like a bailout to me. Whatever we call it, it's clear that the support provided for Canadian banks was much more substantial than Canadians were led to believe. It is worth noting over the aid period that Canada's banks declared $27 billion in profits between them. The CEOs of each of these banks were among the highest paid CEOs in the country. And finally, between 2008 and 2009, Canadian CEOs actually saw a raise. Every single one of them saw a raise, and the average raise was 20% in total compensation.
It should come as no surprise then that we are seeing the same behavior that Bernie Sanders famously spoke out against when discussing Wall Street in Canada with Canadian banks on Bay Street. $12.5 billion was set aside in 2015 collectively for bonuses for all the banks in Canada. The CEO said, we did a good job. We deserve a bonus. Yet, collectively, those same banks laid off 4,600 employees that year. How is it the banks have so much money to reward their executives and CEOs with big bonuses, yet reward those at the bottom with pink slips? Why is it banks that are so well run and so well regulated needed such a big bailout from 2008 to 2010? Why, when banks are in need of a bailout, do they reward their CEOs, the highest paid CEOs in the country, with a 20% raise on average? If nothing was wrong, why did our banks need a bailout in the first place? How bad was the global recession for Canada? Questions need to be answered, and this culture of greed needs to end